Hey there YouTube, today we're making the Whiskey 2400 backpack. This pattern's available on their website for just a penny. You can also buy the backpack pre-made from them. Today I'm going to go over kind of the ins and outs of making it. This is the one I made. There are a few features that are not in the pattern that I added, like this front pocket here. It was a pretty simple thing to do, so it doesn't really deviate from the pattern too much. I also added this inner laptop sleeve, and as you can see, I didn't do a lining on this. You can do a lining and it's pretty simple to do. I had to jump through a few hoops because their pattern is meant for a CNC cutter or someone who has a large format printer, so I had to splice this out onto 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper, but I'll show you how to do that in the video. So without further ado, let's get on with the build, and I hope you enjoy it.
So the first thing I did was go out to Whiskey24's site and download the pattern, which gave me this very large PDF, as you can see here. So in order to get this into a usable size, because I don't have a large format printer, I ended up finding this tool, which I run a Linux box, so I needed to run Linux, but also this was a pretty simple Python pip install, and it worked pretty slick. So next, I loaded up the software, and you can see I opened the PDF in the software, and you can see the original size here is 3031 millimeters by 2828 millimeters. I entered that into this custom width and custom height here, and that split everything out into, I don't want to know how many pages. So my next step will be to print this out and see if I can't get it put together. So in order to print this to PDF, once you've entered in the size here, go ahead and just hit Save PDF here, and choose where you want to put it, hit Save.
So once you have the pattern printed out, next comes assembly. I'll have the page numbers that I printed out for this in the description down below. I actually managed to get down, I think, like 30 pages, maybe 40, as opposed to 207 as the original file suggested. So what you do here is you're essentially going to lay everything out in order, left to right. I generally take a pair of scissors and cut some scallops out of the edge of the line so I can line everything up and then tape it all together. And you're just going to rinse and repeat this all the way through until you get every page done. I did skip the last, I think, like 5 or 10 pages because that was for the zipper gusset that didn't include the handle, and I used a handle in this, so if you need that, you can go ahead and assemble those pages instead of the ones I did. Once you got everything taped together, the next step's pretty self-explanatory. Go ahead and cut the pattern out. On the straps for this pack, I went ahead and added a 1/2 inch seam allowance around the pattern, and then I only cut one out since I'm cutting these out individually, not on a CNC machine. I added the 1/2 inch because I plan on sewing these together and then flipping them inside out, whereas the original pattern calls for them to be cut out of a non-fraying single layer type material. Alright, so now that I've got everything cut out, I've decided kind of go through and decide how this pattern goes together. The strap here is pretty self-explanatory. I went ahead and just cut one of these and added a seam allowance because I'm planning on doing 2 pieces and then putting some foam inside of this. I'm not sure why the pattern has 2 pieces of this unless it's for some kind of lining, but I believe this is the bottom that lines up right here at the base of your front or your back. And there's 2 fronts, 2 pieces for the front and back. That is mostly because this pattern was really designed to be cut out on a CNC machine. For the top, since I'm doing the handle, I left out all the pieces of the pattern that were for the no handle zipper gusset. And so I've got one piece here that is for where the handle is going to go, Then I have the two shorter pieces, which I lined these up on this longer piece with the hash marks to go around the curve. And everything lines up as the same distance. And then when I line all this up and I take this piece to go around, everything comes out almost perfect on that square. So I think this is how we're going to assemble it. So next I'm going to go ahead and start cutting it out.
Like cutting out the pattern, this part's pretty self-explanatory. I went ahead and traced the pattern onto the back of my fabric. One thing to make sure you do here is that you are going to cut out 4 of the strap pieces and make sure you have a front and back for each side. The way I did this is I just flipped the pattern over on the back of my fabric and made sure I marked a front and back piece. So I had 2 lefts and 2 rights for each side. So the first thing I chose to assemble was my front pocket. This is actually not a piece that's included in the pattern. What I did is I just had a scrap piece of material that was a little bit shorter than the front side of the pack. So I measured out as much as I could, measured down about 2.5, 3 inches, split it in half, and then I just sewed a zipper on either side. This will then be assembled to the front of the pack so that you have a nice front pocket. It's not in the pattern, but it's a pretty easy thing to add, and I always like having one extra pocket on the front, especially when they're this simple to put on. So here you can see I'm splitting out the zipper, putting it in teeth side down on the right side of the fabric. When I go to sew this, what I'll do is I'll sew this down, and then I'll fold the zipper back on itself so that the right side is folded forward, and then I will top stitch the whole thing. We'll see that here in just a minute. One other thing I did real quick before I started sewing was I went ahead and took the longest zipper gusset and I measured out length of zipper coil for this. I wasn't sure if I'd have enough, that's why I did this step first. And for anybody that's wondering, I used a number 3 zipper on the front pocket of the pack, and this side zipper is a number 5 zipper. I think the actual pattern calls for number 8 zipper, but I didn't happen to have any handy, so that's why I went with number 5. Now we can get to some actual sewing. This is another addition to the pattern that I added. I kind of did the same thing as the front pocket. I took a piece of scrap that was a little shorter than the back panel was tall, hemmed the top of it, and then I sewed it to the inside of the back panel, wrong sides together. What this does is create a little laptop sleeve or a pocket to put some padding in if you wanted that, or whatever else that's kind of thin and can fit in the back of your pack. This is like the front pocket. This is really easy to add to a front or back panel, so I do it on almost all my packs just because. Alright, so here's the first piece from the actual pattern. This is the shoulder straps. What I did here was I put both sides right side together and then stitched all the way around, and once I had stitched all the way around, I flipped them inside out. I chose to put my clips and the nylon webbing for the clips on the outside of the straps and sew through both pieces just because it looked a little cleaner on this, and because the bottom side of the strap is a little narrow, so trying to put a buckle in there and then getting your presser foot past that buckle looked like it was going to be a problem, otherwise it didn't seem like there was enough space there. So I opted to just box stitch through all top and bottom of the nylon and the strap. It worked out pretty good in the end. It looks pretty clean. My next step was to cut the foam out for the straps. What I am doing was just kind of measure on one side to give myself the angle, and then I measured it out to be, I think it was 2.5 inches wide, so I cut my straps at 2 inches. I probably should have cut them at 2 1/4 or 2.5 because they were a little narrow for the pads, but they still felt pretty good on the arm. Once I had the padding all trimmed up to the size I liked, I went ahead and installed the buckles for the straps. To do this, I just cut out I think it was around 2 inches, maybe 3-inch piece of webbing, folded it over through the buckle, and then box stitched it over the end of the
strap. Well, I ended up in the end having to cut a few inches off the top of my padding because of the space this took up, but it wasn't too big of a deal. Once I had the buckle on the strap, I went ahead and measured the bottom half of webbing for these straps. I went ahead and went with the same length as the top strap. This gave me a little extra in the end, but I'd rather have some to cut off than not have enough after it's all put together. Once I had this cut, I went ahead and melted the edges with my lighter. Next, I worked on the bottom half of the strap. I took the corner piece and folded the top over to create a hem, and then folded it in half again to create the corner piece. I then folded the webbing through the middle of that. I top stitched it down along the hem, turned the corner, and went to the edge of the webbing. I then went over 2 stitches and went back again. Makes a nice little L shape there, and should make everything good and strong, because not only will the webbing be sewn through the corner piece, but it'll also be sewn through the edge of the pack. Now that we have all the strap pieces together, we can start final assembly on the back of the pack. To do this, I lined up the corners, the curved edge of the corner with the curved edge of the strap reinforcement. Another thing I did is I folded the back panel in half and cut a small notch at the halfway point. What this allowed me to do was to measure over from that midway point to make sure that I had the reinforcement pieces equidistant from the center of the pack, so that way they weren't uneven. To finish up the back panel, first thing I did was to shorten the foam a little bit, like I mentioned earlier. Next, I lined it up on the back panel. One kind of neat feature about this pattern is that all of the pieces kind of self-align. So the top edge of these straps is curved at both ends and at the right angle to line up perfectly with the top curve of the pack. So it actually was pretty easy. I did the same thing here though that I did on the bottom. I nipped a little piece out of the hem at the center point so that I could measure and make sure that they were equidistant from the center, just to make sure everything was lined up appropriately. So before we can put the front and back pieces of our backpack together, we have to assemble our zipper gusset. This is pretty similar to how we did that pocket. First, take the longest piece of the zipper gusset, lay the teeth down on the right side, sew it down all the way along the edge, flip it over, or fold over the zipper, and then top stitch along that edge. My camera decided to die while I was putting the handle in the other side, but that one's pretty self-explanatory. I just took a 2-inch piece of webbing, sewed down the middle to give it a little more of a handle shape, and then I sewed it to either side of the small piece of zipper gusset. I then sewed on the 2 medium pieces of the zipper gusset to either side of that, and then top stitch them down as well. Everything came out almost perfectly, so hooray for that. I have a lot about seam allowances when I do stuff like that. So once you have that all done, you can start assembling your zipper gusset to the front and back of your pack. So to begin putting my front and back pieces together, the first thing I did was to take my back square and I folded it in half and cut a notch out of the seam allowance on each side. This allowed me to line the middle of the back up with that square, and the same thing for the front. If I was doing this again, I would have sewn this piece to the zipper gusset first, just because I sewed too far into the seam allowance and it made final assembly a bit of a problem. I got it done, but it would just be easier to sew that zipper gusset as one contiguous piece and then attach it to the front and back instead of doing this first. Here's where the pack really starts to come together. Well, I start out by taking the zipper gusset and attaching it to that bottom square, and then working my way around the edge. I did make a few snips into the seam allowance on the corners just to make that turn a little easier. If I was doing this again, I'd have marked those out from the pattern. They're actually
there's red marks on the pattern that tell you where you need to put these hash marks at, and I wish I had to transfer them over to my fabric. It would have made this a little easier, but just making a few random snips here and there did the job. Once I get this sewed on, maybe you can see where I messed this up, and if you see it, let me know down in the comments. If not, I'll tell you when I get there. On both the front and back panel, I did a double stitch. This just gives the pack a little extra strength. I probably won't need it, but it doesn't hurt anything. This is going to be a donation pack to my workplace's Backpack for Kids program when all is said and done, so I want to make sure it lasts good and long. The last piece to sew on is the front panel. I did the same thing as I did on all the other pieces, where I folded it in half and took a little nip out of the seam allowance so I could line up the centers for both the zipper gusset and the front panel. Once that's done, I went ahead and clipped around the edges. Again, I snipped the seam allowance around the corners just to make it fold a little better, and then double stitch everything down, and that's pretty much the pack. So about the time I went to flip the pack right side out, I realized what probably more than a few of you have already realized, that I forgot to put on the zipper pulls for the outside zipper. Thankfully, it was pretty easy just to seam rip the gusset right at the zipper on that bottom square, put the zipper pulls in, and then sew back over that. So it was a pretty easy fix. It just was kind of a dumb mistake. It usually happens when I do these things in a hurry, is I make stupid mistakes like that. But once everything's flipped right side out, all you have to do is install the bottom snap of your straps, and you're good to go. It turned out to be a nice little pack. I really like the clamshell design. With that number 5 zipper, you can actually grab both halves and just pull the thing all the way open. It wouldn't be that hard to modify this to have an internal panel for like a big first aid kit, which is something I might do in the future, to put a bunch of elastic strapping and Velcro on the inside, so it'd be like a kind of a truck first aid kit type thing, because you could fold it out and get easy access to everything in there. It also worked really good to do something similar like that for, say, your ratchet straps or something like that if you do a lot of towing. So if you enjoyed the video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.